No, it's just where we go.
Okay.
Okay, welcome everyone to our discussion of Darkei Talmud. We're holding in the 7th Siman, and we're going to talk about Diyukim. And see what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. So he says like this: La'olam keshetidayek ez a diyuk me ez a mishnah or brisa or shum mamar ein ra'ui lecha ledayek oso diyuk min haketza leketza ki im yesh emsei b'neihem tikach emsei. Now that we've done Tunos and Hidayon, this will make a lot of sense. He says that when you make a deal from any statement, from a Mishnah, a Brisa, or a statement of an Amora, so you have to be very careful. It's not fitting to go from one extreme to the next in the statement. If there is a midpoint, the statements are the type of opposites that have a midpoint, then you shouldn't go to the opposite extreme. Derech Mashal, he spells it out. Im Omer Lecha, Ruvain Eino Chacham. If we would hear a statement that said, Ruvain is not a Chacham. So he says, Lo Tidayek Aval Hu Sechil. You can't say he's a fool, which would be the opposite end of the scale. Why? Ki efsha she'enu lo chacham v'lo sechil. Aval hu benoni. Maybe he's not wise, but maybe he's benoni. So you always have to check out in your opposites if they have a midpoint. Okay, he's going to say that right now. Aval b'she'en b'nehen emsi. But if a statement doesn't have a midpoint, as telech min haketza leketza. So then it is proper to infer the opposite from the statement. Derech mashal, im yomer lecha. If someone says to you, ata eno laila, it's not night now. So hine tidayek aval hu yom. So since there's no midpoint between night and day, so it must be that it's day. Okay, so the negation of one of the polar opposites is the affirmation of the other if there's no middle point in there. Since there's no midpoint between day and night, so we can make that inference that the opposite is true. Okay? Ukasher tireh ki hamishna or brisa lekach haketz harishon v'nosan bo din ma. Whenever you observe that a Mishnah or Brisa gives us, has a certain subject on one end of the scale, and it says it has a certain din, then it goes to the other polar opposite, and it gives it a different din. It doesn't talk about the middle case. Then you can ask, wait a minute, gufa kasha or kasha resha asefa. Now, you remember we had this, he spoke about this when we had the case in Kedushin, where the man, the Mishnah said, or what's the Bryce said? It said, when a man says and gives, it's nikudeshet. What's the opposite? When the woman says and gives, it's eno mikudeshet. Okay, but there's the middle that was left out. What happens if he gives? He says and he gives and she says, or the opposite. So those cases were not stated, and that will cause a contradiction from the Reisha to the Seifa, because according to the Reisha, if he says and gives, it's marriage. Anything less than that, the middle case, if he says and she gives, for instance, would be not Mikudeshet. But when you make the same inference from the Seifa, which is the polar opposite, it comes out that that middle case will be Mikudeshet, because only when she gives and says it's saying Mikudeshet. But if one of those two are not done, then it is Mikudeshet. So that's the called Kasha Reisha Seifa. So that's what he's trying to say here. When you have a Mishnah that gives you two cases with opposite dinim, and they happen to be opposite cases with different dinim, so then you're going to, by definition, end up with a contradiction in the middle case. Okay? So we went over that before. וכאשר תראה כי המשנה או ברייסה, okay, okay, that's rule number 1. I'm sorry. כאשר תראה שהמשנה או ברייסה, which we just said, לקח קצר ראשון ונוסן בו, ואחר כך לקח קצר אחרון ונוסן בו דין אחר, הנה הניח אמצעי, לא דיבר בו כלל, אז תוכל להקשוס ולומר, או גוף הקשה או קשה רשע הספר. כי מדיוק הרשע נראה שאמצעי אין לו הדין. Since the Reisha says that only when he gives and says is mikudeshet, so it should be eno mikudeshet when anything less than that happens. And from this, in other words, he does one of the acts, not the other one. Now, why is that true? If you would say that the extreme and the middle have the same din, then lisna emsa'i the ana amina ki mikol shekain haketzer yesh lo also din. It has to be that you're medayek, that if he says and gives, it's mikudesh. It must mean if he says and she gives, it's ain't no mikudesh. Why? Because if he says and she gives is also mikudesh, that's a bigger chiddush. So that should have been said instead of he says and he gives. Am I being clear? Okay.
Yes.
Do you hear what I just did? Yeah, I just went.
Well, I wasn't listening. I was thinking of other examples.
So in other words,
my son is learning. He's learning Sukkah now, and the Gemara does this in the beginning of Sukkah, where it says Shechamsim Mitzulsa is puzzle, and there's Mishnah Lamed Beis on Chaf Beis Amud Aleph that says the other way around. It says that if it's Tzilosim Rubim Chams, it's kosher. So the question is, what happens when it's equal, when the shade is equal to the sun? So from the first Mishnah, it says Chamas and Rubim Tzilasa is puzzle. It's mashma that it's equal if it's kosher. Where later on it says Tzilosim Rubim Chams is kosher. It's mashma that it's equal. It's puzzle. So there you go.
Excellent. Exactly. Okay. Now, why are you forced to make those diyukum? Now that's what he wants to say now. Because he says, if it was true that the middle case had the same din as the polar at the extreme case, right? So then it should have been said, because that would have been a bigger chiddush, right? You tell me the middle case, and then certainly I'll know the extreme. Okay, so that's why we can always medayek from the extreme to the middle. Okay, if it's true that if he says and she gives that it's also mikudeshet, so then say that case, and that's a bigger chiddush than telling me when he does both acts it's mikudeshet, right? So that's why he's showing us the force to make that diuk from the reisha to the MCE. Okay, so that's what he says here. But tamhu the ilo temahachi, if you don't allow, or you don't say that the extreme case means that the midpoint case has the opposite din. Ela sheketza MC dinim shava, but you say no, the mid case has the same din as the extreme case. Then lisnei MCE v'anamina kimi kol shekena ketzi yeshlo so din. So the logic is, then you should have taught me the middle case, which is the bigger chiddush, and then I'll say kol shekain, the more extreme. If already he gives and she says it's mikudeshet, and certainly then if he does both it's mikudeshet. Va'az outside a hechrach yitirtzu. So then the Gemara is forced to say either reisha daf b'sefer kadei nispa. No, we're only going to medayek from one of the two. Or gam ken chana menayon nakat, or the same thing. Just take one of the two. We saw some other interesting answers also, by the way, when we did the Kedushin case. But basically, you have to get out of the problem, either by changing what the statements mean, or the easiest way is this, saying that we were just medayek from one or the other. But then why did we have to have the other statement if we just medayek from one and not the other? And the other one was very interesting, that they said there in Kedushin that the middle case is a suffix. That was really creative. The contradiction showed that the middle case, when he gives and she says, and vice versa, is a suffix mekudesh. Okay. Anyway, those are the rules of diukim. Very important. You always have to make sure that your diuk is valid, and it can only be valid if there's no midpoint. If there's a midpoint, you have to be careful. Okay. This middle diuk, saying that the extreme has the din, and therefore the opposite din should be in the MCE. תוכל לעשות כאשר לא יהיה הדינים חיוב ושלילה או איסה והתה וכשאין בהם מחלוקת תנאים ואמרים. So you have certain tanaim when you can go to the middle din. If they're real opposites, then there is no mid-case, like plus chiyuv is and is not a real opposites, or aser and heta. Or if it's a machlokas, you also can't talk about the middle case. Why? אבל יש אחד מאלו לא תאכל, כי כן יאמר לך כוח להתר עודף, או להודיע כוחו של רב פלוני, כמו שקדם לך פירושו. He's going to say that if it's a machlokas between two people, so we said it's not, you have to be very careful making that a diuk from the case to the middle, because it's not necessarily it's not necessarily a true deal. They may have done, it really may be true that the middle case is the same as the extreme, but to show the other end of the machlokes, they had to write it in the extreme case. Okay, if you remember what we did that work before we did Kol Hatera others. So you have to be careful in making your diukim for that midpoint. That's what he did in the simon. Okay. Now in Ches he says like this: La'olam kisheteyan b'shum drush of shum inyan kishem shetasim magama panecha lahavin heiteb loshen ha'inyanahu yesh lecha gam ken levakesh darkei lahachshosh kenegdo. We may have done this together. I'm not sure. Whenever you're investigating any explanation or subject, just like you put the emphasis in understanding the language, the heitev lashon ha'inyahu, also yesh lecha levakesh darchim lahakshos kenegdo. You always have to keep your mind active, and just whatever you're reading, it's not just to accept what's being said, but you have to check it out and make sure there's not any other alternatives to what's being said. Stir up all the possibilities that exist in the subject we're talking about, or in the language, how it's being expressed. Remember, those are the two basic units that we see spoken about all the time. There's the subject matter, and then how it's expressed in the specific language. So the first thing you have to do is clarify any doubt or any other possibility in every thing that you read. Okay, it's an active involvement in reading, especially Torah Shabbat Peh, which is based so much on inference. It's very, very important that you read critically all the time, because if you don't, then you don't get into the real issues. And uladas hataos taos v'hakushel she'efshar lasol b'jushahu. You have to investigate any mistakes or difficulties that exist within the presentation of this explanation. When you do this active and critical type of thinking, so then you'll actually get to the truth. And you actually clearly understand what's being spoken about. As we keep saying, there's fuzzy understanding and there's clear understanding. Clear understanding only comes through analysis, critical analysis. Ki mi shemargish hachole miyad yemotze refu'lo. Because only the person who feels the sickness will immediately find the drug for it. Very important statement. I use this also, by the way, the Shabbos talking. A person has to realize the problems that he has. He has to define them. He has to verbalize them. Once he realizes the problem and defines it and verbalizes it, then he can go seeking a solution. But if you just let things pass by quickly and don't critically analyze them and don't understand clearly what's being said and what the difficulties are, so then you won't realize that there's a hidden message underneath. And that's a very, very, very powerful statement here. The person who feels that there's sickness will immediately find a refuah. So,
right, but it's interesting. He says the prerequisite that is both. First, to understand clearly what's being said, and to understand what the kashas are. It's not. There are people who just jump in and they just want to ask questions because they want to show, I don't understand. No, first understand. Then you can ask the questions.
Excellent. It's a very important rule. It's basic. When I always say, Rabbi Goldsman will say, oh yes, but do you have a statement, a question, an answer? Are you raising an objection? Or just do you want attention? But the real point is what you said. You have to be clear about what you think is being said, and based on what you think is being said, then you can ask your difficulty. Okay? Because there's two parts there. Maybe what you think is being said is not being said, and maybe you do understand what's being said, and your difficulty is valid, and we're going to have to then re-understand what you understood in the first place. Okay? Hashem put his hand in Mitzrayim. Wait, Hashem has a hand? No, he doesn't have a hand. Okay, but if you don't think about it and clearly say, wait, it says here that Hashem has a hand. He put his hand in Mitzrayim, didn't it? That's what it says, doesn't it? So if you don't clearly understand what's being said, then you can't understand the Kiddush. Okay, that there's such a thing called a metaphor. Okay, it's a whole Kiddush, you see. That means he put his power, not that he has a hand, but his power, his might was demonstrated in Mitzrayim. Okay, very, very, again, these are basic Aleph-Beit principles that, when they're stated clearly, makes a difference between a clear discussion and a fuzzy balagan, where no one really understands what the other person is saying. Okay. 3. יש לך להיזהר שלא לקבל הקדמות או עניין בתחילה העניין במושלם. Be very careful, he says. Don't accept premises or information, the content of something, in its entirety. עד שתחקור ותחפש עליו, until you investigate and you search it out. As it says, ki pesi yamin l'kol davar. Only a simple person believes everything that he hears. Okay, so it's a rule. You must critically analyze everything. And that also means you have to look at the premises that things are based upon. It's not only what the statement says, it's also what premises led up to that statement. Okay, so if someone says a statement, well, what's the source of that statement? Does that source clearly lead to that conclusion? Those are questions that must be asked. Just don't say, well, he said it, and therefore it's true. Okay, it might be nice in the Bakiyas class, but when you're really trying to understand something, then you have to slow down and investigate everything and make sure that you understand all the premises that are around it. And especially because when we learn Gemara, one of the big problems is it's an expert Now, well, the first problem is they speak very briefly. But the second problem is it's an expert system. You're talking about professional learning people who are at a very high level of discussion. So they're presuming that the reader is at their level. So that's why we immediately, like now we're doing Daf Yomi there in Kutcher, everyone immediately is running to Rashi because everyone realizes there's not too much you can understand here by reading the text without the background. But that's the problem that we have, is that we don't understand the background premises, and that's what he is telling us to slow down and make sure you're just not accepting words without understanding the premises that led up to that. Now, he says in Dalet, Ulehishomer shelo yeh bir bedava ba'atzmo b'derech hekesh saviv. Make sure what's going on is not circular reasoning. You can't explain something. You can't explain an unknown with an unknown, with another unknown. Okay? You can't explain something by itself. Or, he says, oh, ne'elam b'ne'elam, acher k'mohu. Or something that's unknown with another unknown. So the first one is circular reasoning. You're just saying the same thing. You're not saying anything new. You're just repeating what's being said, but you didn't prove anything. The second one is called, you're taking something that's unknown and you're trying to prove it with another unknown, so you also haven't done anything. Now here's another interesting. Make sure something nigla is not proving something else nigla. If something is obvious, then we don't need a proof for it. So why you bring a proof to something that's obvious? Ki habir hanachon eino rak bir hanelam benigla. The way to have a proper explanation is always to take something which is unknown and bring a clear proof to it. Okay? And that's also, again, when you're learning, you have to be careful. You know, if you don't see how the proof led to the result, then you have to ask. Okay?
So what it means to say is
not there. It's happening all the time, you know. Yeah.
Ne'alam benigla is that you have something already that's known and you use what's known to explain what's unknown. To explain the ne'alam, benigla using what's known.
Right. Right. Again, a small little principle, but it's important. Right. You have to know that. Okay. Number 2. V'da ki derech hanosim v'nanotim. Now he's going to tell us another important rule about how people argue in the Gemara. Rotzlama amarayim, the amarayim. Kesherotzim lahakshos neged eza mishnah, or eza brisa, or ma uledas im hu tzadek alav. Also hamamra asher alav anu danim yikachu also lemesupak. V'kol sham amarayim Amamarim asher michutz yikablum lamitim ulahak shenegdo. Interesting rule he's going to say here. When Amarayim fight with each other, and they want to ask a kasha from one Mishnah to another Mishnah, or a brisa to when they're asking a kasha from on a Mishnah, from a brisa or another statement, to know whether the Mishnah that we're talking about is accurate or not. So it says, Osa Mamri Mashiach Alav Anudana Yikachu Osa the Masupa. What they do is they say, look, I don't know what's being said here. Okay? But everything else I'm going to say is known. Okay? So this statement here I don't know what it means because it contradicts all these other statements which I am taking as given. Okay? The statement on the floor is not known, and every other statement is known. Then what we do is we after we define our statement here by its relationship to all the other true statements, then he says they go to the other statements. Osa lakachatam misupakim. Then we go to those other statements which we had just held were true. V'yiksha kenegdo mizeh, v'yisbaer kan shehu amiti. And then we ask kashas on them from what we've established over here. Omimama acher shehu yedei shehu amiti. Or from some other statement we know which is true. So that's how the clarification and truth of statements are done. Why? If we take all statements at one time as misupah, then there'd be no way to ask a kasha from one to the other. Let's go over what he says over here. He says over here that you have a statement on the floor, which you're now going to investigate. You have a Mishnah. You want to investigate what the true message of this Mishnah is. So what you first do is you look at this Mishnah in terms of all the other Mishnahs or brises or statements that are being said, right? And you say all those statements are givens, and now they're going to come into conflict with our Mishnah. Okay, so now once I've done that, I then have to clarify what our Mishnah is talking about in light of all of the statements. So then I limit or define what my Mishnah is really talking about. Okay, good. Now that I've defined what our Mishnah is talking about, I go back and then I go in to investigate each of those external points to see if they were indeed true. I now go back and investigate them and see if they were true. Let's read that inside again. He says like this. Derech hanosim v'notim, the give and take in the Gemara is like this. Rosim the Amarayim. Kesherotzim lahakshos keneged eza Mishnah or eza Brisa or Mamar Ma. When they want to ask kashas on any Mishnah, Brisa, or statement. Uladas im hu tzarek alev. They want to now know, is this statement true as it's stated or not? Of course it's true, but the question is, in what aspect is it true? So what they do is like this. Oso hamamra asher lav anu danan yikachu samam supach. The statement that we're talking about on the floor, whether it be a Mishnah, Brisa, or a statement of Amara, we say, I don't know if it's true or not. Kol sham hamarim, all the external statements, asher michutz yikablim lemitim, and we accept all the other statements, and therefore lahakshos kenegdo. So there we can say all these external statements now will come and attack our Mishnah. Okay, and then what will happen is what? We'll start setting up our Mishnah in light of all those external statements. Then, after we do that, v'achar kach yeshuv b'makom acher, v'yikachu osam hamamrim asher hanichu kan b'mushlamim v'kachakam misupakim. Now we go back to the questions or the statements that were attacking our Mishnah. And we say, wait a minute, are those statements really true or not? V'ikshu kenegdam mizeh shenizbar kan shu amiti. Then we go back and we say, wait a minute, how do those statements look in light of what we just established here? O mimamar acher shu yidu shu amiti. Or the statement out there, which we're accepting is true, maybe it's not true in light of some third or fourth statement out there. Okay, so what we first do is we say that our statement here is being attacked. We want to define it. So we define it in terms of all the other statements externally. Then we go back out there to all those statements which we were using to attack our statement and check them out if they're true or not. Okay, that's the system, he says. Like the Gemara says, Gufa Kasha. You go back and
check it out, right?
Or you're not Gufa Kasha, Gufa, right? And it goes back and it checks the tax. Okay. Now he says that has to be because we took everything to Supak and we can never ask a kasha on anything. So he says you have to start with presuming that the externals are true. In our case on the floor is Supak. Then we'll go back and we'll check them out. That's the system. Ula'olam b'kol lashen הנוהג בתלמוד, שיצא לך בשמוע, הרי משתדל לדעת מה טבעו ובאיזה אופן דרכו לבוא על הרוב. He says like this. When you have language that's presented to you in any shmua, so always try to figure out what's its tivo, its nature. Ube'eza often darko lavo al harov. How is this language normally used? Varoa gamroa imhu ba ba'oso derech gamken. And see if the language being used here is the language being used in its general sense. V'imlav tzarech hataladas ma nishtana. And if you see that the language here is being used in different sense, you have to ask yourself, well, why is it? Okay. V'imata mesupag bo she'ena yadeya min hakutivo. If you don't know what a particular word or phrase means in general, chapes hadin b'talmud be'eze derechu. Look around and try to find a similar use of the word throughout Shas. Now, here, if you remember what we were doing, Baba Kama, so there was a big problem. It said, Arba Avos Nezikin, and Tosfos said, wait a minute, how come it doesn't say Hain here? Normally, the language, most of the time, you have a subject and a verb, as we said. There are 4 types of damages. Here, it doesn't say Arba Avos Nezikin Hain, they are, there's the verb there, it was Ne'elam. In other places, it's not Ne'elam, Arba Rosh Hashanah Hain. Okay, Arba Shomrim Hain. So there it is. Tosfos makes a difference between the normal use of language, the Hain, between our case and the other cases, and then has a problem why that language is not being used here. Okay, it's exactly what's being done. Okay, that's number 3. Okay.
I think this is a good place to stop.
Pause here. There's a good place. Let's stop here.
Getting sleepy.
There's loads of information. Okay, right. Going by very quickly. But what I would love to do with you is, after we study these things, go through a sugya carefully and use these tools and apply them, and we'll see that our communication will turn from fuzzy to clear. That's the whole exercise here. So Bezrat Hashem will have that opportunity. But first we have to know the ground rules. Right? If you don't know the ground rules, it's very hard to play the game.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Have a great week.
Okay, you too.
If we can get...
I'll try to get you some of the recordings. Yeah, I'm going to work on it.
Okay. All right. Be well. Thank you very much for joining us, Shimon. This is... These classes are a little bit full with information, okay? We're going to have an opportunity, Bezrat Hashem, to open up to the floor and actually talk more, but right now we're trying to understand what's going on. But it's very nice that you came, okay? Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, be well. And you can always pop in and shout out. We don't, it's not... I have to be stopped, or else I think everyone understands what we're doing. So it's very good that you ask. There's no problem. If you don't understand something not clear, or you have difficulty, as he says over here, it's very important to get the interaction. Okay, have a great week, everyone, and thank you for joining. And we'll see you next week, Bezrat Hashem.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
So good.